Now, security forces have opened fire on anti-military protesters in Cairo, killing at least 3. Egypt's health ministry says the total number of casualties following days of renewed violence now stands at 14, with 700 reported injured. Let's discuss the developments in Cairo now with Rees, the political activist from the British-based Stop the War coalition. Many thanks for joining us here on our team, Mr. Rees. Now, Egypt's two-thirds of the way through its long election process to replace the military government, and yet the protests continue. What's driving this impatience, do you think?
Well, I think two things. Firstly, the Supreme Council of the Armed Forces, the governing body of Egypt since the fall of Mubarak, has simply continued Mubarak's policies economically, socially, politically, and has on many, many occasions before this attempted to drive the protesters from Tahrir Square, to break strikes, to make them illegal. And I think that many of those people who fought in January and February, and I was amongst them, believe that the government is continuing the Mubarak-era regime policy, and that couldn't be clearer with the current crackdown, the extreme violence now being used against the protesters, some of which I think, to your credit, you've shown on Russia Today, the now emblematic video of the woman in the blue bra being stamped on by security officials, and of officers now firing live ammunition to the crowds. I think what many people believe is that no elections that take place now could be described as free and fair when they're taking place against this background.
And the police and military brutality which you describe there, it closely resembles, doesn't it, what Egypt saw earlier this year when anti-Mubarak protests rocked the country. Isn't it strange that the military rulers don't seem to be learning from these mistakes?
Yes, well, I think we have to understand what happened in the initial revolution in January and February. And what happened was this, that the demonstrations, the strikes at that time, the beginnings of splits in the military themselves, forced the senior ranks of the army to dump Mubarak in order to protect their own rule. They got rid of the figurehead in order that they could continue in power, and it's been a struggle between those forces, organised by the Supreme Council of the Armed Forces at the top, and the protesters, the strikers, the demonstrators, the revolutionary forces on the other side, which has characterised this whole period between the 11th of February, when Mubarak fell, and the fighting that we're watching today.
And this transitional period which you refer to, it does place the West in a somewhat awkward position, doesn't it? After Mubarak was toppled, it was hailed as a win for democracy, drawing military and other aid worth billions of dollars. But now they're critical of this very heavy-handed approach taken against the protesters.
Well, the West has been as complicit in backing the SCAF regime since Mubarak fell as it was in backing the Mubarak regime when he was in power. There is still £1.3 billion of US military aid given to the Egyptian military. You will have seen the videos of the protesters holding up the CS canisters that are fired at them in Tahrir Square with the words "Made in the USA" on them. We know that David Cameron, when he visited Tahrir Square, had behind him British companies, including arms companies, and these people have been part of the rearmament of the Egyptian military. The very arms that are now being used against the protesters are provided by the Western governments who have been backing this regime. So the hypocrisy is times two. There was hypocrisy with regard to Mubarak, and there is now further hypocrisy with regard to the Supreme Council of the Armed Forces regime.
Well, let's forward now briefly. The Islamists do appear, don't they, to be stealing a march on their rivals at the polls so far. Do you think that the protests were actually all about getting an Islamic State from the very beginning?
No, I don't think that was what was in the minds of the vast majority of protesters at all. And indeed, I think that we have to look at the record of the Muslim Brotherhood in relationship to the dominant SCAF regime. You see, sometimes they've been opposed to it and have joined the demonstrations, as they did a month ago in Tahrir Square, and other times their calculation has been that they're going to do very well out of fast elections, and therefore they've lent support to the regime. Well, now is the moment where that kind of vacillation is no longer going to be acceptable, I think, to millions of Egyptians. You cannot see people being trampled by the security forces, beaten in the square, shot at, 700 injured, and still think that you're going to carry on participating in the election, that the outcome of that election will be regarded as legitimate by many millions and millions of people in Egypt. So I think it's now time for the Muslim Brotherhood to reconsider its stance and perhaps to think that their profile, their whole political reputation would be better served by rejoining the protesters in Tahrir Square.
OK, Rees from Stop the War coalition, many thanks.